Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. Today, Patrick Watson is joining me, and we're going to do a part two and a follow up to my episode with Richard Tarnas on Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions in history. Hey, Patrick, thanks for joining me.
Uh, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, well, this is kind of a Uranian event because actually I just got done recording the episode with Richard just a little bit ago, and he's very generous with his time. But it was such a wide-ranging discussion that we didn't get into all of the different examples that we could have gotten into. So because I've had some caffeine to drink today, I'm not going to lie, I was kind of energetic and excited to share some of those. So I thought I reached out to you to do a follow-up, and you generously agreed to join me today. So we're going to go through some example charts of Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions in history to act as like an addendum to the last episode, I guess you could call it, right?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about what I know on this topic, and yeah, I'm excited too about some of the examples that we've talked about.
You and our friend Nick Dick and Best actually just did an episode, a live stream on Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions just a few days ago as part of your new show, which is called the Astrology Live Stream, right?
Yes, very creatively titled. Definitely without relation to another very well-known astrology
Yeah,
public
high,
presentation.
highest form of flattery, my friend, highest form.
But we just talked about Jupiter Uranus conjunctions, and we mainly focused on looking at examples of Jupiter Uranus recurrences. So looking at people who were born close to Jupiter Uranus conjunctions, and then looking at what happened in those people's lives when those planets came back into alignment. And there were some really interesting uh, stories that came out from that really illustrate in a very vivid way what these cycles sort of mean, and potentially hint at some of the possibilities of this current Jupiter-Uranus conjunction.
Nice. All right. Yeah, I want to get into some of those. So we'll look at some natal chart examples, some transits, and some mundane planetary alignments from the past during the course of this. All right. So I'm going to share some of my notes on the screen just because I wrote extensive notes in preparation for this episode earlier today with Tarnas. I want to return us back to the very core example that he gave right at the beginning, not to dwell on it too much, but the example that he gave is kind of paradigmatic with Galileo and with Kepler because their observations and these breakthroughs that both of them had happened pretty much simultaneously over the summer of 1609. And one of the things that was really interesting while the conjunctions were still happening and still taking place that I meant to mention in the last episode was that when Galileo discovered the four moons of Jupiter on January 7th, 1610, the moon was actually conjoining Jupiter and Uranus at the time. And it was actually only 2 days before a lunar eclipse in the sign of Cancer. So this is important because, on the one hand, we've seen this happen with the moon landing, for example, where the moon landing occurred on the day of a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction when the moon also came through Libra and conjoined the moon-Uranus conjunction at the same time, which is just spectacular.
One
But it
small
turned
step, one giant leap for mankind.
exactly
Right.
right. But it turns out that that pattern goes back where sometimes the moon itself can act as a trigger of the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction at some of these important events. In this instance, things having to do with the moon itself. But also one of the things I noticed now that I'm paying attention to eclipses and their proximity to major events in world history is that in some of the most important Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions, there was also an eclipse that was taking place within a week of the conjunction. So that's something to pay attention to as well.
Wow. Yeah, the first time I became aware of the moon landing thing, I was pretty bowled over. Also worth mentioning that that would be one of the only Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions that occurred not only at 0 degrees of a cardinal sign, so kind of aligned with that world axis and global importance, but also in proximity to Pluto. It wasn't with Pluto in Libra as well, but it was a fairly close arrangement of not just Jupiter and Uranus, but Jupiter and Uranus with Pluto. So like a sort of more extreme version of that Jupiter Uranus conjunction. And, I think certainly stepping onto another body that isn't the Earth is, a really monumental step for this species.
Yeah, that was one of the things we pointed out was just the Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions sometimes act as like throwing gasoline on a fire that's already there. So that in this instance, with like the 1960s, it really made it blow up even larger in terms of not just the scientific and technological advances that took place in 1969, 1968, 1970, but also some of the like social unrest that was happening, like the protests, like the famous Democratic National Convention, where there were huge protests and unrest at. There were great destabilizing things taking place. There were like those famous assassinations, for example, with both Robert Kennedy as well as Martin Luther King Jr. There was just a lot of stuff going on at the time that was characteristic of Uranus-Pluto, but also of Jupiter just magnifying it.
Absolutely. I mean, in a in a century that includes two world wars, somehow the 60s still manages to stand out as being kind of like the wild one or the biggest one or the most important one in some respect.
For sure. So here is Galileo's moon's chart. This is like approximate. I don't think I have the time right on this. It might have been on the night of the previous night, but you can kind of see it was January 7th, 1610, and you can see the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction there with Jupiter at 12 Gemini, Uranus at 9 Gemini, and then the moon had passed over those two during the course of that day.
Wow. Yeah, that is that is amazing.
Yeah, and he literally observes the moon. He realizes there's or observes this other planet. He notices that there's moons going around it and realizes that something's amiss. So that was a major one. Um, Kepler was a major one because Kepler, um, part of what he did when he published his work in the summer of 1609, which was actually very close. The dating's a little iffy, but it was very close to the conjunction. Is it established that the planets move in elliptical orbits, which are like ovals rather than perfectly circular orbits, which everybody had believed was the case ever since Plato basically said that it had to be perfectly circular orbits back in like 375 BCE. So when Kepler published this and established that the planetary orbits were elliptical and that once you knew that, it allowed you to calculate them more precisely, it completely overthrew the previous assumptions um, that had been prevalent at that point for almost like 2000 years, basically. It was a huge revolutionary change in science and cosmology at that time because it also helped to confirm the Copernican model, which is the idea that the sun is at the center of the solar system rather than the Earth. So this was like huge, like epoch changing stuff that was happening in science at this time.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like Uranus is about disruption of established paradigms, and in this case, a kind of Jupiterian one. So one about doing it, with increased knowledge or wisdom, and it's been downhill for Ptolemy ever since, right?
So it's really funny that you mentioned that because that was another one that I found that I was super pleased with over the past couple of days, actually, as I did an intense bit of research because I wanted to take this interview with Tarnas as an opportunity to both review his work and the alignments that he had found, which were largely focused on the period from about 1500 forwards, because that's the point at which you start getting really good documentation of historical figures and events and biographies, and especially scientific works and when they were published. Once you go before 1500, things are a little bit sketchier in terms of whether you even know the year that something was published or what the time frame was when a person lived and died and things like that. It gets a little sketchier. However, cool thing I did find is Claudius Ptolemy, who is the one who set up the planetary models that Kepler basically was overthrowing with some of his work back in the early 17th century. So Claudius Ptolemy lived in the 2nd century, and we actually have an inscription that's been discovered that Ptolemy dedicated in the year either 146 or 147 CE. And in this inscription, it contains a detailed list of astronomical parameters and data that Ptolemy used to establish and refine his models for the movement of the planets and other celestial bodies. It was like his preliminary model before fully revising and establishing everything in the Almagest. But this inscription falls right next to a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, which occurred 3 times in Sagittarius and Capricorn in the year 146 CE, which very, very closely overlaps with this inscription, so that we know that at least one version of Ptolemy's planetary models were completed at the time of this Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, which then ties it in directly with basically what happened later when Kepler proposed his theory.
Yeah, I wonder how many 83-year Jupiter-Uranus goal periods that is. It'd be interesting to know if there's that kind of long count connection between those these events, the kind of establishment of the Ptolemaic model of the universe versus the kind of grand overthrow of it as well, through Galileo.
Yeah, I actually want to talk to you about that, the goal year periods, because that's a major thing I've become focused on. I found some interesting stuff here with this. However, before we get there, I do want to mention one other thing that I found, and I did want to give a shout out first to Vandana Gayan, who gave me a lot of research assistance or did a lot of assistance in helping me to research this episode and some of the events I found. And one of the ones that Vandana found that was really cool is in the year 132 CE, which was one Jupiter-Uranus cycle because they occur every 14 years. So this is exactly 14 years before Ptolemy's inscription under the next conjunction occurred. There was a polymath, a really smart guy who specialized in a bunch of different fields. And his name is Zhang Heng. And in the year 132 AD or CE was the year of a conjunction between Jupiter and Uranus. And he invented a seismometer, which helped to detect earthquakes and what direction they came from. So it was like a major scientific device in being able to detect earthquakes. And what's interesting that I found is that this scientist was like a polymath, and he's often compared to Ptolemy. And so what's interesting about that is that Ptolemy was active in Alexandria during the same time period, because from the Almagest, we know that Ptolemy was making observations from the years 127 to 141 CE. So that means these two polymaths, basically one in China and another in Alexandria, Egypt, in the Roman Empire, were active, like doing these amazing things in similar fields, like in parallel, oftentimes probably in connection with the same conjunctions.
Wow. Yeah, that really is incredible. In fact, you can kind of find that phenomenon happening in other places in astrology where you have people who are kind of doing the same sort of things in different contexts in parallel, along with the same periodicity, the same cycles, the same conjunctions. It's almost like astrology works. I might be convinced.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
don't
I'm
know. We're
getting that.
still we've only been in it like 20 years. What, something for you?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm almost there.
almost
Um,
there.
yeah, no, that's really incredible. Super cool.
Yeah, so I thought that was a good one. I have some others, but you mentioned the goal year periods, and that's something I did want to talk about because that's something you and I did a podcast on where, how do I explain this? So I meant to talk about the goal year periods in the Antikythera mechanism episode because it turned out that that was part of why the Antikythera mechanism worked, because it incorporated these complex mathematical models from the earlier Mesopotamian astrologers, where the ancient Mesopotamian astrologers had discovered these planetary period recurrences where the planets would recur and be in approximately the same position on approximately the same day of the year, under certain time frames, basically under a certain number of years. So we already know, because in Hellenistic astrology, they were using one version of these, which is we refer to as the minor periods of the planets, which is like the 8-year period of Venus, the 15-year period of Mars, the 25-year period of the moon, and so on and so forth, which are the minor periods of the planets. And that's based on synodic cycles with the sun, right?
Yeah, yeah. All minor periods and major periods, they all are when a given number of synodic periods, synodic returns, it comes out to the same interval of time of relating to the sidereal orbit. So it's like when the sidereal and synodic orbits, like when they add up to the same amount of time, that's when you end up with these particular goal year periods. And it's yeah, it's fascinating because it allows you to make these connections across time that might not be immediately obvious if you were just looking at a chart, but do become very important when you start looking at the whole timeline like this.
Right. So it's like we're familiar with the Hellenistic periods, which are much shorter in duration. The longest one is 30 years for Saturn. For Jupiter, it's 12 years. But it turns out that the Mesopotamians had much longer periods where they were able to identify even longer recurrences between the sun and the planet. So here's a table from Alexander Jones's book on the Antikythera mechanism, which gives the Babylonian goal year periods, that some of which ended up influencing the design of the Antikythera mechanism. And the periods for those listening to the audio version, Venus is still just 8 years, but Mercury is 47 years, Saturn is 59 years, Mars has two periods. There's 47 years and 79 years. And then Jupiter has two periods, which are 71 years and 83 years.
I think you meant to say 46 for Mercury for your listeners.
What did I
But
say?
47. I think you
Okay.
just it's just because of Mars, I think. Um because Mars is 47 years and Mercury is 46. Sorry, just
No, thank
wanted
you.
to make sure
Well,
they caught that.
you've stopped me from like starting a 2,000-year tradition of like alternate periods
Yeah,
from
yeah,
a
yeah, yeah.
typo.
Um,
So these are the goal year periods in the Mesopotamian tradition. You and I, Patrick, just recorded an episode of the Casual Astrology Podcast a few weeks ago where we talked about how crazy these periods are because they line up extremely well with the repetition of a planet at the same degree of the zodiac, roughly on the same day of the year during certain intervals. Um, and I meant to talk about this in the Antikythera mechanism episode, and I forgot. And then it came up recently in the year ahead forecast because in doing research with Nick Dagan Best, I discovered that one of these planetary periods is actually recurring this year, which goes back to the founding of the United States, the period for Mars. And the retrograde that's coming up later this year is actually going to be a recurrence from back when the Constitution was being put together, basically. And a few other things. You can listen to Year Ahead Forecast for when I mentioned that. So this is important here. Oh yeah, you had actually discovered also the other thing that was relevant was the bridge collapse in Baltimore ended up being the period of Mars, right?
yeah, the bridge opened it almost exactly 47 years to the day that the bridge collapsed. And so that means the bridge opened with the sun in Aries with Mars in Pisces, sort of telling the potential for watery disasters, especially because at the actual moment that the bridge was opening, Mars was culminating in Pisces, and uh, and then 47 years later, at the exact return, literally within just like a couple of days of 47 years. That's when the bridge collapses, when Mars again came to the same degree in Pisces with the sun in Aries. Um, and of course, it was a watery disaster, as Mars and Pisces would suggest. So it was both an interpretive match and also a temporal match that is exactly related to Mars and its destructive potential.
Yeah,
So I thought that was pretty mind blowing.
that's pretty crazy. So, and that was connected to the 47-year period of Mars, and that just shows you how well that recurrence is. And then the Mars period that I had found for the year ahead forecast, I think it was based on the 79-year period for Mars, and the connection was something like um, the Constitution was being ratified during this Mars retrograde period in, I think, Leo or can right?
Right. Yeah, it's like this Mars retrograde that kind of is either in Leo or sometimes goes slightly back into Cancer. I believe the
Yeah.
one from the 1780s um was when the states basically were struggling to get on board and to decide to join and to make this the way that we would govern ourselves. And then I think the next one you said kind of comes out to roughly the
So
post Civil War era.
yeah, so that one was in the 1700s at basically the foundation of the United States. And then you jump forward 79 years, you get the same Mars period and the same Mars retrograde. And then the Civil War has just taken place. And then they passed one of the core, I think, amendments to the Constitution. And one of the laws that it put in place was that if you had previously fought against the government, that you couldn't run for office, I think, right?
Yeah, you couldn't yeah, that's uh yeah, that exact I forget the exact amendment that is, but that's exactly correct.
So, and that was like a post-Civil War thing in order to basically make it so that people who had fought against the Union couldn't then take over the government after that. So then you jump forward 79 more years, so one more Mars cycle, and you get to the 1940s, and that retrograde happened earlier the same year that Trump was born. So then Trump is born under the same period, 79 years later. And then you jump forward 79 years from that, and you get to later this year in the late 2024, early 2025 timeframe, and you have a repetition of the exact same Mars retrograde period um, over again. So as a result of this got me really interested in studying these Babylonian goal year periods and paying attention to them. And you and I did this whole discussion going through them and how interesting they are. And one of the ones that you really focused on is how the 83-year period of Jupiter, where there's a recurrence of Jupiter at the same exact degree on the same exact day every 83 years, how that roughly coincides with the Uranus synodic cycle as well, because Uranus is on an 84-year cycle. And as a result of that, when I was studying Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions in particular, I could see that the Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions kept recurring roughly in those 83, 84-year cycles.
Yeah. It's what I think is so wild about that is that skeptics will sometimes say astrology is not valid because ancient astrologers should have known or should have maybe how could they have made accurate predictions if they didn't know about all the major players that there are? How could ancient astrologers practice astrology correctly if they hadn't known about Uranus and Neptune and Pluto? But interestingly enough, um, given that the goal year of Jupiter does correspond to a roughly a Uranus return, it is interesting that they would have been inadvertently paying attention to this particular interval and that they might have noticed that, well, not only is it a close return of Jupiter, but maybe that there's something kind of wild about that particular interval as well, which would obviously make sense because Uranus would be roughly returning to the same place that it would be 83 years prior. And even more interesting is that because Uranus's orbit is roughly half of the orbit of Neptune, it means that after 2 Jupiter goal years have passed, you get a Neptune return. Neptune, it will roughly be in the same position after 2 Jupiter goal years have passed of 83 years. And, and then weirdly enough, because of the orbital period of Pluto is roughly 3 times that of Uranus and roughly 1.5 that of Neptune, 3 Jupiter goal year periods ends up corresponding with a Pluto return. So it just so happens that because of the structure of the solar system itself, that it's kind of nested together like this, kind of Russian doll kind of architecture. It means that if ancient astrologers were paying attention to these ancient Babylonian goal year periods, they would actually have been inadvertently paying attention to roughly to outer planetary cycles, despite maybe not knowing about those outer planets. And so I think it's mind blowing on several levels, but I think an important way to rebut the idea that just because ancient astrologers didn't know about Uranus and Neptune, that they couldn't have done astrology properly or something.
Yeah. I mean, that's so fascinating to me, and that's a really huge discovery because, yeah, I think your point is really well made that um, in addition to discovering something where that 83 years, every 83 years on the same day, Jupiter would be in the exact same position. Um, the fact that they recorded and emphasized that even more, they probably saw it as significant because they were also seeing extraordinarily important events taking place in 83-year intervals as well, which means that they may have actually been picking up on the fact that Uranus would have been making a complete revolution around that time as well. So basically, there's an inference there that they could have been picking up on the existence of the outer planets, and this is the strongest evidence that I think anyone's ever found that could imply that, basically.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise, why pay that much attention to it? They already had the 71 year, but they knew that the 83 year one was important as well. And perhaps it's because it was just a closer return of Jupiter. But it just so happens that it does correspond with outer planetary returns as well.
Yeah, let me actually demonstrate what that looks like. So you showed me a handy thing here in SolarFire where when you do the animate chart feature, you can actually set the interval. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cast a chart for April 20th, 2024, which is the day of the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that's about to take place at 21 degrees of Taurus. We can see here that Jupiter in this chart set for 1 p.m. in Denver. Jupiter's at 21 degrees and 45 minutes of Taurus, and Uranus is at 21 degrees and 48 minutes of Taurus. So it's just a little bit before the exact conjunction, but I'm putting them here to put them in the 10th house. So we know that the conjunction is going exact at 21 Taurus this year in 2024. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump forward exactly 23 years to the day and see what the chart looks like exactly, or sorry, 83 years later. So I'm going to move it forward. We jump forward to April 20th, 2107, the year 2107, and we see Jupiter is exactly at 21 degrees of Taurus, and Uranus is at 18 degrees of Taurus. So Uranus has moved 3 degrees earlier, but otherwise we have an exact recurrence of the position of Jupiter and a very close recurrence of the position of Uranus, so that you can almost time this not just to look at the exact position of Jupiter, but also potentially of the recurrence of conjunctions of Jupiter and Uranus as well.
That's exactly
So
right.
so that's jumping forward to the next one, 83 years. So let's go back. Here's April 20th, 2024 again. Let's go backwards in time 83 years and see what we find. So I jump forward 83 or jump backwards 83 years to April 20th, 1941, and we see that Jupiter is again exactly at 21 degrees of Taurus, and now Uranus is at 24 degrees of Taurus. So it's three degrees later when you go backwards in time. but Jupiter stays consistent exactly at 21 degrees of Taurus, so that this 83-year period of Jupiter that the Babylonians found is just an incredibly powerful tool for tracking long-term planetary cycles and repetitions.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
pretty cool. Pretty
yeah,
cool.
that is pretty cool. Yeah, no, absolutely, for sure.
So, one of the things that that means is that we need to, one, look at this 1941 conjunction especially as being important because not only was this the last time that Jupiter and Uranus conjoined in Taurus, which is the sign that they're about to conjoin in now, but it's also the exact Babylonian goal year period repetition of Jupiter. So there should be some things thematically about that time period that are actually relevant or could have some kind of repetition today.
That's true.
And
Although to be perfectly honest, the it was tricky researching this period just because so much of what I would find when I would be searching around the internet for like things that were going on in the 1940s was all related to the war effort. And the main sort of technological event that would seem to be occurring in this time frame is that it seems like this is when um the key discoveries were being made to crack the German Enigma code. You remember Alan
yeah,
Turing was part of the team that was able to crack this like unbreakable code, and in so doing, sort of creating the world's first computer. So
yeah.
I guess it sort of matches, but
And I have some things and we'll get there in a
oh,
second.
cool.
But actually, first, let's see, to wrap up this period or to wrap up this point about the repetitions, there is a drift with the 83-year repetition when it comes to the Jupiter-Uranus cycle in terms of tracking that. So here in 1941, Jupiter was at 21 degrees of Taurus and Uranus had drifted to 24 degrees of Taurus. If you go back further, like 83 years earlier, it brings you to April 20th, 1858. At that time, Jupiter is again at 21 Taurus. Uranus is now at 27 Taurus. So it's drifted, what, 3 more degrees
Mhm.
um, at that point. If you go back 83 years earlier, to April 20th, 1775, now Jupiter is still at 21 Taurus and Uranus is at 0 degrees of Gemini. So there's this continual drift of 3 degrees in this instance that's really interesting. And that's not the only thing when it comes to the Jupiter-Uranus cycle. One of the other things I was noticing is that um, because Uranus is on an 84-year cycle and Jupiter is on a 12-year cycle, they meet up every 14 years. But when they meet up, they're always roughly, when Jupiter catches up to Uranus, from one conjunction to the next, they're usually about 2 signs apart by the time Jupiter catches up for a conjunction. And actually, it ends up working out so that it's roughly about a sextile apart between each conjunction. And Peter from AstroSeek actually just released this great tool on his website and this great animation, which shows what that looks like. But here's a version of it to give you the simple version. So because the Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions end up taking place about a sextile apart over a full cycle of like 84 years, it ends up creating a hexagon or a grand sextile basically across the entire zodiac, essentially.
That's really cool.
So that's pretty cool, right? So it's like,
No, for sure. Yeah.
let's see, where do we start? So we start from,
1941
let's see,
in Taurus.
1941 in Taurus, and then 14 years later, from 1941, you get the conjunctions that occurred in Cancer. So it's like, late Taurus, the conjunction was at 25 Taurus, and then the conjunctions 14 years later were between 24 and 27 Cancer from 1954 to 1955. Then 14 years later, you get the conjunctions in Libra. Um, and it's a little close to the sign boundary. So it's like the exact sextile would be like late Virgo, but because it's shifting across the sign boundary, it's just over the sextile. But you get them in Libra from 1968 to 1969, from 0 to 3 degrees of Libra. Then 14 years later, you get the sextiles, you get the Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions in Sagittarius from, there were basically, there's 3 of them all in 1983. Then in 1997, you get them in Aquarius. And then finally in 2010 and 2011, you got them in late Pisces and early Aries, before eventually it returns back to where it is and where it started in Taurus this month, when the conjunction occurs in Taurus on April 20th, 2024. So that's pretty cool as a pattern. And over a long time frame, it eventually creates this huge hexagon, or like grand sextile, that gradually drifts basically between 1 and 4 degrees for each conjunction, and it has a retrograde drift to it. Just like the Venus retrogrades, it creates a pentagon that recurs 2 degrees off every 8 years. There's a similar thing with the Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions, where it has this drift of like 1 to 4 degrees every roughly 83, 84 years.
That's really cool. See, I hadn't seen this tool yet. That's really really neat. You can see the geometry of that, and I assume that then you'd have the same pattern if you were mapping out Jupiter-Uranus oppositions, or it would be a similar type of hexagon. It would just be happening in the open spaces between these conjunctions.
Yeah,
Very
exactly.
cool.
Well, and this is incredibly crucial because then, it creates an analog to the medieval technique of looking at the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions in the different triplicities, and how those triplicity shifts would indicate the start of different eras or different epochs in human history. I think you could do something very similar with this technique, and it's very much tied in with these long-term cycles and repetitions. But for our, that'll be the subject of further studies in the future. But for our purposes, I think we can start to get a little bit of insight into how that might work by paying attention to what's happening right now today versus what was happening in 1941, and some of the parallels.
Hmm.
So let me pull that
Really
up because
cool.
I just found this recently. Okay, so I went back and I was working on the 1941 conjunction, and this is what I got. So one of the things that was really the most impressive, and I think that there's the biggest parallel, um, was, the war between Britain and Germany is already happening in Europe at this point. The United States is coming off of World War One still, and is still in isolationist mode. So Roosevelt knows that the US needs to get involved in World War II, in the war that's building up in Europe, and he knows its inevitability, but he's not able to, due to political pressure and stuff at the time. So one of the things that he does, that I'd always heard about, but I never fully grokked the importance. I never understood the importance or the parallel with today, is that on March 11th, 1941, he signs the Lend-Lease Bill, or he's able to get past the Lend-Lease Bill, where basically they're able to start sending goods, sending material support to Britain and other places, other allies around the world, in order to start helping to fund them and to arm them, while keeping the US ostensibly like neutral basically in the war. Right?
Wow. Okay, I hadn't had I had not made that connection, but that is very obviously Yeah, I mean, that is a clear analog to something that is happening today.
Yeah, so it's
Wow.
like, let me read my summary. The Lend-Lease bill was crucial because it allowed the US to become the quote unquote arsenal for democracy by providing desperately needed military supplies to allied nations fighting against Axis powers. This aid, without requiring immediate payment, helped nations like Britain stay in the fight while avoiding the crushing debt that had followed World War I. Britain staying in the fight while avoiding the crushing debt that had followed World War I. The program signified a clear shift away from US neutrality, demonstrating a commitment to the Allied cause and escalating involvement in the war even before officially joining. So I think the parallel today is obvious because the Biden administration, for example, has been just desperately um, passing and sending support to Ukraine, but has been also running into major obstacles, especially this year, in getting additional funding sent to Ukraine. And there's a big like political fight about that, where Republicans are holding up the bills to send further support or further aid, even though Biden is treating it as if it's something that's like being used to combat an enemy or somebody that he sees an inevitable conflict with without getting into a direct conflict with Russia and with Vladimir Putin. So I think that's part of the parallel today. And I think it's also partially because the conjunction is happening in Taurus and you get some material significations of like providing material goods and material support, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that absolutely does. Yeah, there's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of ways that make sense just in general with like the Uranus transit through Taurus. For example, you had the establishment of Fort Knox, and collecting all the nation's gold, and you had, in fact, the SEC itself was founded on the day Uranus ingressed into Taurus, which is the nation's way that it regulates securities and trading. You had the establishment of Social Security, which was a major sort of material uh, revolution in some ways, at least in terms of the United States, and reallocating its resources in ways that were maybe seen as revolutionary for its standards in that time. So it's uh, so we can definitely envision Jupiter coming to Uranus as sort of maximizing this idea of aid or support or just in general expanding or multiplying the stuff, given that it's in Taurus and to support well, it's certainly the way the United States sees itself as the arsenal of democracy. In that time, I think the leadership, this country still sees itself as we still see America as opposed to, at least in its most aspirational sense, aspiring for freedom and democracy, even if we don't always practice it very well ourselves. uh,
Yeah. Yeah, and
so,
that's a whole separate thing that we'll get
right.
into. But so yeah, that was striking, I think, as a direct parallel today.
Hmm.
The other one that was weird, though, I'd never fully taken the full significance in was the exact conjunction in 1941. It occurred May 8th, 1941. That's the closest proximity um, to the one in that time period, May 8th, 1941. Later that month, Roosevelt gave a major speech in which he announced an unlimited national emergency, quote unquote, in response to Nazi Germany's threats of world domination. So Roosevelt stressed that there was a grave threat posed by Nazi Germany. He emphasized the need for America to ramp up production and become the quote unquote arsenal of democracy. That was the phrase he used at the time to aid allied nations. While it was not an official declaration of war, the speech signaled the country's increasing preparedness and growing support for the fight against Hitler. The speech was a critical turning point in the country's response to World War II, and it marked a significant shift towards preparedness and support for the Allied cause, even though the US wouldn't officially enter the war until later in 1941. So this is another really significant thing, and I don't know if there's not a direct parallel yet in terms of the US and some of the stuff going on in terms of declarations like that. But it ties in with the whole lend lease thing. And it shows that there was a very important turning point that occurred very near the Jupiter Uranus conjunction that year in 1941, that ended up being like a pivotal turning point in history.
Right. The only other thing I sort of found from that time that kind of struck me was the fact that I guess it was like in May of 1941 that um the British uh captured a submarine that had the Enigma cryptography machine, which is what like people like Alan Turing, if you saw the movie with Benedict Cumberbatch, Imitation Game, they use that to break the these German coded uh, German messages. And this sort of leads to the development of the first computer, and so there, it's maybe a bit of a stretch, but it is interesting that it was in May of 1941 that was sort of when the Enigma cryptography machine was captured.
Okay, so the thing that would allow them to have the breakthrough to break all the German codes.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's cool because Turing himself, he's a great example because he had like Uranus on the midheaven. I always think of him for that. He had Gemini rising, and Uranus was at 2 degrees of Aquarius, and it was probably somewhere around his midheaven in his chart, sextile Jupiter at 7 degrees of Sagittarius.
Wow. Yeah. So, okay. So, yeah, Uranus ends up being a very important planet in this chart, and certainly for someone who would make technological breakthroughs as a huge part of his reputation and legacy. That's pretty on point.
Yeah. And then going back to Roosevelt's speech
Hmm.
and the almost like anticipating a war or developing preparedness for a war. It makes me a little nervous. Like one of the things that's happening that's like technologically oriented is I think this year that new chip fabrication, was it factory, is supposed to open up in Arizona, where Biden had been pushing to bring production of computer chips back to the US, because right now all the primary most advanced chips are being created in Taiwan, but Taiwan is, the subject of a major dispute in terms of China. And if a war ever broke out between like the US and China, um, basically that would create huge issues because all of a sudden the world wouldn't be able to get the most advanced computer chips. And so there's almost like an element of that. I mean, I hope not in the long term, but there's almost an element of that there with Biden pushing to move the production of crucial things that would be necessary if a war was to break out or if a conflict was to break out between the US and China, and bringing those things back to the US.
Yeah. No, that makes some amount of sense. This reminds me of a story I read just about a day ago about Microsoft and OpenAI investing $100 billion in this new Stargate AI venture, which basically um, would the way they're billing it is freeing themselves from the shackles and over reliance on NVIDIA, which is the world's most sophisticated chip maker, but like you said, just happens to be in a kind of a geopolitical hot zone. So I think that's interesting, even the way that they characterize it. Like even this Yahoo news article about it says Microsoft and OpenAI bet $100 billion to free themselves from the shackles and over reliance on the world's most profitable semiconductor chip brand for AI chips. And Uranus, of course, has all those connotations of freedom or independence, and this is especially in a technological sense. Um, so it seems like even in the public sector and private sector, there are these sort of parallel attempts and in tandem attempts uh, to become technologically independent. Uh,
Mm.
so that's seems like a big Jupiter Uranus theme to me.
Yeah. And then finally, two other things that happened in 1941, not long after that Jupiter Uranus conjunction, is on June 22nd, 1941, the Germans invaded Russia with Operation Barbarossa. And this is interesting because it was actually a surprise attack, and even Stalin was surprised because he didn't think it was coming. And the Germans were able to make rapid advancements as a result of the surprise element. And one of the things I found that was interesting is that that day, the moon conjoined Uranus and Jupiter that day. So it was actually a really perfect lineup, just like some of those other conjunctions of Jupiter and Uranus where the moon sets things off.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
wow.
Here's the chart for that. I don't have a time chart, but so we can see Uranus is at 28 degrees of Taurus, Jupiter is at 6 degrees of Gemini, and then the moon swoops in and conjoins them that day in late Taurus and early Gemini. Um, it was also interesting because there was Mars a Mars Neptune opposition that was exact at 21 Pisces and 24, or 24 Pisces and 24 Virgo. And also Mercury had just stationed retrograde in Cancer just 2 days earlier. So that element of like surprise, that element of um, keeping it secret and doing something under the cover of like, you know, throwing people off of your trail and other things like that.
Right. Although we know that it was ultimately sort of ill-fated, and you can see there that Mars is only 76 days away from stationing retrograde. This 1941 retrograde was where Mars went retrograde in Aries. And it's just something I noticed is that any military power that decides to kind of initiate an attack before the Mars retrograde or on the Mars retrograde, that tends to not work out quite as well. This chart reminds me a lot of in some ways it kind of reminds me of Pearl Harbor as well, because Pearl Harbor happened at a Sun Jupiter opposition rather than the moon conjunction to Jupiter, and that was also with Saturn Uranus like in that chart there as well, and it was another sort of similar um surprise attack. um Maybe not quite as obvious as the Operation Barbarossa chart is, but uh,
Yeah.
there is a kind of similarity in a luminary touching off Jupiter there.
For sure. So this is another important though, like Jupiter-Uranus thing, because that was an absolute turning point in the war, and this is the point where Germany basically really messed up, and eventually, just like Napoleon had, they would lose the war, and um, the invasion of Russia would fail, and they would end up getting pushed back, and then eventually the Russians would push in from one side while the Allies came in from the other side and squeezed Germany. And then the war ended in Germany in 1945 with Hitler's suicide. But the failed invasion of Russia was a huge part of that. Um, yeah, basically, it was a
Yeah,
huge turning point. So,
absolutely.
one last thing that's also relevant that I found about this 1941 conjunction, and then we'll move forward, is so the Manhattan Project, even though it officially began in 1942, there was an important turning point in 1941 that laid the groundwork for the creation of the atomic bomb. So there was this report that the British worked on that was called the Maud Report, MAUD, where a committee of British scientists were researching whether it was possible to create an atomic bomb, basically. And what happened is that in March of 1941, the report came back saying, yes, it was possible to create seriously damaging huge bomb out of nuclear material, um, and that it was feasible and could be produced within 2 years. So later that year in July, the report was delivered to the United States, and then eventually President Roosevelt was briefed on it. And following that, Roosevelt approved a concerted push to develop an atomic bomb, and they started putting things in place, which would then eventually lead to the creation of the Manhattan Project in 1942, and then eventually to the actual creation of the atomic bomb and its deployment in 1945. But this was the crucial turning point when British physicists figured out that it was possible the Jupiter-Uranus, conjunction, and then also delivered that news to the US. And then everything started moving from there.
Wow. It's I just think of how, Richard Tarnas, it makes this great analogies between Uranus and Prometheus. And I feel like nuclear technology is kind of probably the most vivid modern example of like the danger inherent of giving um humanity, fire, in this case, nuclear power, and how Jupiter conjoining Uranus is sort of like giving a thumbs up to whatever Uranus presents, whether it's just total chaos or just broader possibilities, unbounded possibilities. And so I really was just feeling that as you were describing the dynamics of that time and that decision.
That's a great point. And it's funny that you mentioned that because remember that biography that was written of Robert Oppenheimer, which the movie then was based on,
American
that came out last
Prometheus.
summer. It was
Yeah.
called American Prometheus.
Yeah.
And I just pulled up his chart, and he had Mercury at 22 or 21 degrees of Taurus. So it would have been very close to that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction.
Dang. Wow.
Yeah,
That is something.
that that is something. So that's just a preview of how I think some of these 83-year repetitions are important and why we need to pay attention and study them. And I'm sure there's other parallels to today that need to be looked at. Um, but we can find some really interesting things, and those are just some tantalizing previews. All right, so let's jump around to some other stuff. Um, you know, I guess before we move on with the parallel to today, one of the things that's about to happen is the Bitcoin halving. And there's other stuff going on with Bitcoin right now. And that seems relevant because this conjunction is taking place in Taurus. And there is something not just about, with Lend-Lease, the idea of like a material support to allies, but also with monetary things, where ever since Uranus went into Taurus, back in what, like 2018, we've seen Bitcoin just like take off over the course of the past decade and become this huge thing that's starting to shape the world in different ways and starting to affect monetary policy. But we know that in the next few days, very close to the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, that there's about to be a development with Bitcoin, right?
Uh, so yeah, there's this kind of and I may not be the most educated person to speak about this, but as far as I understand, yeah, there's this event known as the halving, which is when the miners who mine for Bitcoin get half of the reward that they used to. And it's supposed to decrease the supply, increase the value, and the response to these events, in at least in terms of its price history, seems to these halving events seem to precede great changes in the value of Bitcoin. So that event we are reaching very soon. So it's very interesting that it's happening so close to this major out-of-planetary arrangement, because there have been other halvings before, but the fact that this one is coinciding with Jupiter conjunct Uranus suggests that there might be something more special than we might otherwise assume about this particular event. Another event that's happening, which doesn't necessarily affect only Bitcoin, but cryptocurrency as a whole, is that there is this current dispute between the SEC, which I mentioned came into existence at when you're on the day Uranus entered Taurus. Uh, there's a dispute between the SEC, the government, and the largest cryptocurrency exchange, Coinbase. And the outcome of that case is expected to arrive fairly soon. A judge is expected to make this ruling, basically establishing whether or not cryptocurrency should be considered a commodity or a security. If it were to be considered a security, then it becomes regulated by the SEC and it's sort of under more strictures. But if it's judged to be a commodity, then it's more open season. And so it's conceivable that with Jupiter, the planet representing judges, coming to the aid in a sense of Uranus, it seems like the I think that the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Taurus would mean that the judge ultimately rules in some way that's favorable to the continued operation and proliferation of cryptocurrency. In the same way that when Jupiter was conjunct Venus about to station retrograde in Leo in the summer of 2015, the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage in the United States. So we saw Jupiter, sort of representing law or judges or customs, sort of giving its sense of confirmation, its thumbs up. It's, Jupiter's core function is confirmation. So it's like giving approval to Venus, is giving a judgment in favor of unions. And so in a similar way, with Jupiter coming to Uranus, there would be a way in which the law or judges are giving their approval or thumbs up to the revolutionary and disruptive potential of Uranus, especially in this context where it's in Taurus. It's about a novel financial class, a novel financial asset like Bitcoin or cryptocurrency generally. And very interestingly, the CEO of Coinbase, which is involved in this suit, his name is Brian Armstrong, and he was born on January 25th, 1983, with a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Sagittarius in his natal chart. So he's going to be experiencing a Jupiter-Uranus recurrence where at this halving event for Bitcoin, and likely as a judge is providing the verdict. Now, what's especially interesting about Brian Armstrong's history here is apparently he says that he got into crypto. He first read the Bitcoin white paper, but he says somewhere in 2010 or 2011. And of course, late 2010 and early 2011 was another Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, the one that was happening in early Aries and late Pisces. So it would seem that we have this person born at a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Sagittarius, becomes introduced to cryptocurrency at the next Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Pisces Aries, and is now on the cusp of this potentially new era in cryptocurrency as this new legal distinction is made potentially about how cryptocurrency is going to be regulated or not regulated in the United States. So that obviously has huge repercussions for him as the CEO of that exchange, but it also connects him to this larger narrative about the disruptive potential of these financial instruments.
That's incredible. So that's a great principle. And I've seen that principle elsewhere where, the take-home lesson is that this person, the CEO of Coinbase, was born on a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. He had an important turning point in his life occur at two subsequent Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions. And we actually see that in the lives of other people that have that signature as well. So it's something to pay attention to. And it's one of the great lessons I think I've learned from studying some of this material.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's perfect.
So you actually found there's actually two very closely parallel examples of that would actually be great ones to use here as well that are more recent examples. And this one just cracks me up when you explained this one on the live stream the other day. I thought it was perfect. Actually, I meant to mention this to Tarnas because Tarnas would have loved this.
Yeah, I thought he would have.
I didn't get a chance to mention it, but hopefully we'll send it to him because I think he'd get a kick out of it. So you want to set this one up?
Sure. So what's interesting about these two particular people is that they are both associated with portraying a similar kind of hero, and they both come into playing these characters at a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. So the people we're talking about, and maybe I didn't set that up very well, but the people we're talking about are Chris Hemsworth, known for playing Thor, the son of Odin, more or less kind of
God of thunder.
god of thunder, and Henry Cavill, the guy who's the most known for playing Superman, the son of Kal-El, more or less two guys who play gods, who portray gods in some respect, in their respective franchises. And so they were both born at Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions, and both came into playing those roles at the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in late 2010 and in 2011. It's actually even more striking if you have the exact dates of those developments.
And that's just striking. Let's look at the charts
Yeah, of
first because
course.
it's so incredible. So here's Chris Hemsworth. We don't have time charts for these two. Actually, I saw one on Astrodatabank, and that's why I mentioned Astrodatabank in the last episode because it's submitted by an unreliable source, and I would
Mhm.
absolutely not recommend that people take it for granted because it's a source that has submitted false birth times before. So as a result of that, I'm using a noon chart, and I hope Astrodatabank at some point, yeah, fixes that, but they've been reluctant to so far. So this is Chris Hemsworth chart, and he has Jupiter at 1 degree of Sagittarius and Uranus at 5 degrees of Sagittarius. And he literally, over the past, what, like 14 years now, has been playing in like multiple movies, the Marvel like superhero movies, this iconic role of Thor, the god of thunder.
Right. I have to laugh too because he's got the sun in Leo, he's got the hair for it, and some people might look at this and say, "Well, Patrick, come on." A lot of people were born in 1983. They're not all Chris Hemsworth. I mean, just in general, not everyone can be Chris Hemsworth. But if you notice, there is something special about the particular time he was born with respect to the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, because he might not have been born at the exact conjunction themselves, but if you look closely, he was born just 3 days after Uranus stationed, uh, 3 days before it stations direct, and he is born just 12 days after Jupiter stationed direct. So he was born very close to the stations of those planets. And we know that when you're born close to stations, especially within 7 days, that those planets should, in theory, become more intensified through life. They sort of occupy that condition, phasis. So
Yeah.
he might not have been,
It
yeah,
intensifies the signification of both planets.
exactly. So it you would, if we didn't take that into account, we might skip over why this conjunction would necessarily be particularly sort of loud or something in this chart. But it is clear
It's such
that
a funny astrology thing. Like it's so almost not just loud, but also annoying. It's like the the guy that's been playing the God of Thunder has a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. It's the two planets that symbolically are like associated with like Jupiter, Zeus, who's the god of lightning, and storms, and then Uranus, which is associated with like electricity. And it's just
yeah,
kind of crazy.
yeah, no, it's wild. This is the guy. And then
So if that
yeah,
wasn't enough, here's the birth chart of Henry Cavill, who was born on May 5th, 1983. Look at the position of Jupiter and Uranus. Uranus is at 8 degrees and 2 minutes of Sagittarius, and Jupiter is at 8 degrees and 44 minutes of Sagittarius. They are conjunct within a degree.
exactly. So in this case, we can see why it's so loud in Henry Cavill's chart, because he was actually born super, super close to the actual exact conjunction of those planets. So I think that's another reason why I think they're a great pair to study in some ways, because they both have Jupiter Uranus sort of, even without time charts, we can tell that Jupiter and Uranus would be sort of loud in their charts. One, because they have them really, really close together, but then the other one because they're born at those special moments where those planets are at turning points in their annual cycle with the sun. So, and of course, if we think about, Superman, I mean, uh, it's not quite as literal as the God of Thunder, but this is a a character that is about transcending the normal limits of what a person can do, fly around and shoot laser beams from their eyes and super strength and just generally being basically invincible.
Yeah. Well, and
Aside from,
also
yeah.
it's like Superman's also like an alien who's like a refugee basically who lands on Earth and is raised by a human family as a normal human person. Like he grows up and has a normal Midwestern life, but then as he gets older, he realizes that he's extraordinary and he has all these powers and can do these things that other people can't do, and then becomes this iconic, like legendary figure in the mythology, this like larger than life figure in that in as part of that mythology.
Right. And the particular way that he's portrayed in the Zack Snyder films as well, as they really play up the idea of him being kind of godlike. They sort of create all these sort of Jesus Christ parallels, um and then even in the the Batman versus Superman movie, it's sort of cast as like day versus night and man versus God and all these kind of he plays an especially deified version of Superman. So it's
For sure.
so but the real so if that wasn't enough though, it's the fact that they come into playing and or being cast as these characters during the same time frame with the same Jupiter-Uranus conjunction from
Yeah.
late 2010.
And so it's like that conjunction occurred in what was it, January of that year?
So there were three, I believe.
Right.
um
Here, let me animate the chart. I'll put it in a bi-wheel first for Hemsworth, because Hemsworth was interesting because his movie came out, the first Thor movie in which he played that role, came out April 17th, 2011, when the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction was still co-present basically in the same sign.
mhm.
Did I say Jupiter? Yeah, April 17th, 2011. And we see Jupiter at 18 degrees of Aries, Uranus is at 2 degrees of Aries, and there's a whole stellium in Aries, including Mars, Mercury, and the Sun. Um, so that's a nice recurrence of Jupiter Uranus, just as he's like, taking on this larger than life role.
He had been filming the role since early 2010, and there were reshoots that happened in late 2010. So if you actually track the exact conjunctions of Jupiter and Uranus, they happen during the entire time frame in which he's filming this and
Mm,
becoming Thor in some
nice.
respect. So, for anyone who's less than impressed by the distance between Jupiter and Uranus at the actual movie release, the full story does make it more clear that the filming of this took place over the course of the Jupiter Uranus conjunctions in Pisces and Aries. Um,
I mean, I think that's one of the things that came up really strongly in my research is I know, Tarnas focuses on that 15-degree range for the most intense range in terms of the degree-based orb, but the co-presence is really important. Like as
it
soon as
absolutely is.
Jupiter moves into the same sign as Uranus, like that conjunction starts being active, and you start seeing Jupiter-Uranus stuff taking place for the entirety of that,
Oh
which is
yeah.
in which is interesting because sometimes if Uranus is close to a sign boundary, it can accidentally extend the period longer if it becomes co-present in one sign, but then Uranus moves to the next sign, and then Jupiter then subsequently moves there the next year. It can extend it to like a 2-year period.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I wasn't trying to. I shouldn't have sounded like I was throwing too much shade at current presences. I no, I completely am on board with that. It's just if you are paying attention to that sort of degree-based conjunction, then it does correspond pretty well to the time that he is becoming this character. Now, when you look at Henry Cavill, pardon me, and you actually look at the date that his casting was announced. Oh, one other funny thing about Henry Cavill is during that same year, during 2010, before it was announced that he was going to be playing Superman, he was filming a movie called Immortals, where he plays Theseus,
Mm.
who is also kind of a half man, half god. It's uh and the I think the exact date of his casting was like really early 2011, and it's very very close to that the exact Jupiter Uranus conjunction, which sort of makes sense when you consider that, well, Henry Cavill himself was born pretty close to that Jupiter Uranus conjunction, and we obviously don't know how long he had been auditioning for the part, or how long he'd been in negotiations for the part, but we can imagine that that must have taken at least some amount of time prior to the public announcement. So,
Yeah.
by it's perfectly possible that the exact conjunction Jupiter Uranus, is when he got like the phone call to, submit his audition tape or something, whatever it was.
Yeah. So,
Um,
but on January 30th, 2011, it was announced that he would play Superman to much fanfare, and Uranus was at 27 Pisces, and Jupiter was at 1 degree of Aries. So they were still very, very closely conjunct and just coming off of that exact conjunction.
exactly right.
That's really cool.
Um,
So that's a great lesson in terms of people sometimes taking on this iconic role that ties in with Jupiter Uranus, and sometimes having a recurrence transit of important turning points, just like we saw in previous episodes with the eclipses, where we established that if somebody was born within a week of an eclipse, then they would tend to have some of the most important turning points in their life take place on eclipses in the future. We're seeing something similar here with recurrences of Jupiter Uranus conjunctions.
Yeah, absolutely. Something quite interesting actually about this current Jupiter Uranus conjunction is the fact that we would expect, based on this past iteration uh of Jupiter Uranus conjunctions, that this would represent some sort of new phase in their careers or their life's work. Since the last one in 2010 through 2011, kind of made them synonymous with a particular character. It's quite interesting because, um, literally, I think like tomorrow or a day from now or so, Henry Cavill is appearing in a new movie called The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, which is about this. I guess it's sort of based on this real life team of commandos basically in World War II. So it's like a World War II action film, sort of set in the same period that we've just been talking about, where
Mm.
Uranus is in Taurus going into Gemini, and similarly, uh, Chris Hemsworth is about to appear in this movie, which is a follow up, but also a prequel to the Mad Max movie. It's like about Furiosa, and I guess he plays like a villain type character, which is completely different from what he has been popularly associated with, which is, this very heroic figure. So it's interesting to see that the themes of Jupiter Uranus might continue in terms of Chris Hemsworth doing something that is completely different that wouldn't have expected from him, which is very Uranus like. And then, for Cavill, it seems to be potentially relating to kind of living out this previous period of history. I also just heard that apparently he and his girlfriend are expecting to become parents. So that's
Mm.
another um interesting potential that perhaps this is like a family thing, in the Cavill family. Who knows? I wasn't able to find much information about the the family's birth dates or anything.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens.
Right.
All right. So there's a couple of contemporary examples. Just wanted to share that because it was a cool example of recurrences. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about one of the major things that kept coming up in history when I was looking at this, and that Tarnas emphasizes, but that I found more examples of, is uprisings and revolutions coinciding with Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions. So the American Revolution is the sort of like paradigmatic example of that. The American Revolutionary War starts with the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, and then 14 years later, the French Revolution starts with the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. So it's like this perfect parallel. But I would recommend everybody to just go on and look at the charts for that year, the year of the conjunction. The exact conjunction happened June 8th, 1775. And then compare the charts because it's just incredibly, incredibly striking what happens. It's like the Boston Tea Party had occurred before this in 1773 as a precursor. And then the British passed the Intolerable Acts as like a response to the Boston Tea Party in 1774. And then you just start getting this string of really important events in 1775. The battles of Lexington and Concord and the shot heard around the world, April 19th, 1775. So that's very close to the exact conjunction, June 8th, 1775. You get um, the first Continental Congress had occurred September 1774, and you get the second Continental Congress on May 10th, 1775. And they meet and form the Continental Army and appoint George Washington as commander in chief. You get the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17th, 1775. Um, and you get the Declaration of Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, July 6th, 1775. So it's just incredibly impressive how well the start of the American Revolutionary War coincides with this Jupiter-Uranus conjunction even more than you might realize just like reading that as like a headline, because it's like every astrologer at this point repeats that as like a thing everybody knows, but the actual details of that are incredibly striking when you start breaking it down.
I'm a little disturbed that the Battle of Lexington and Concord is exactly for Jupiter goal year periods to almost today.
Mm.
You were the one who actually alerted me to this before, but just reappreciating in this moment uh, the gravity of that potentially. Yeah, so it's interesting to think what that sort of means in our current moment in terms of what revolution is being set off now. Um, so one one thing comes to mind, which is that if Jupiter conjunct Uranus it has the potential for judges to sort of give their blessings in a sense to Uranus, then we know that this hush money trial with the very Uranian figure, Trump, is happening soon, and
Yeah.
it's
I don't want to go back into
yeah,
current stuff too much
okay,
because it's like we all know what's like happening right
all
now and like
right,
what
okay,
and what's coming later this year and
sure,
the potential for that. I think the implication is clear at this point, but let's just do the
okay,
ancient history
yeah,
and let
yeah,
people
that's
draw conclusions.
fair enough.
So here's the chart for the Battle of Lexington and Concord, battles of Lexington and Concord. And like you pointed out, Jupiter was at 21 degrees of Taurus then, and Uranus was at 0 degrees of Gemini. So this is what do you say, 483-year Jupiter cycles back at this point.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we're really taking it back to the Revolutionary War period in terms of the repetitions and in terms of like the foundation of the country at that time. So that's really striking. Tarnas mentions this as an aside in Cosmos and Psyche, but I thought it was incredibly striking symbolically that the Statue of Liberty um, was born basically at a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, which is pretty striking symbolically. Is this like symbol of freedom?
Did you see that image of the Statue of Liberty being struck by lightning?
No.
It's like a few weeks ago.
Okay.
There was this image being passed around on social media of the Statue of Liberty being struck by lightning, and everyone was saying like, "Wow, this is an omen." And
Mm.
and I thought of the Jupiter Uranus conjunction, the fact that yeah, it sort of came from a Jupiter Uranus conjunction. I thought, what is that? What does that mean? Um, so yeah, nicely put.
Yeah, so it's like we get that. We get the American eclipse that just went across half of the country, which is an omen, interesting omen in and of itself.
Right.
But here's I believe this is the Statue of Liberty chart. So it's Jupiter at 20 Libra, Uranus is at 8 Libra. This is October of 1886, and Venus is conjoining Jupiter there in Libra. So it's a nice little positive lineup of those three planets in the sign of Libra.
Wow.
So moving on with the French Revolution, I think Tarnas already went through that a little bit, but again, it just very well coincides with the start of the French Revolution. And then what's interesting is that things really get crazy in the years after the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, but this is right when the Uranus-Pluto opposition really starts to hit, and that's when you get the reign of terror and things
Right.
sort of really getting out of control.
Yeah, that's really that's wild. Um a more contemporary one that comes to mind is the last Jupiter Uranus conjunction in 2010 to 2011 was the
I
Arab
want to get
Spring, right?
I want to get there, but there's
All right.
one in between, which is I'd always heard this one, and I know Nick mentions it because of the connection with the Venus retrograde, but the Nat Turner's slave rebellion took place August 21st through the 23rd, 1831. Um, this one is actually incredibly striking once you get into the astrology of it. So the synopsis was Nat Turner was an enslaved preacher who believed that he had a divine mandate to lead a rebellion, and instigated a violent uprising in Virginia. Um, so the synopsis I've written down that I compiled, it said Turner and his followers killed approximately 55 to 65 white people, making it the deadliest slave revolt in US history. The rebellion was ultimately crushed by state forces, and harsh retaliations followed, including executions of many people involved, as well as many innocent enslaved people who were not involved. Nat Turner's rebellion had a profound impact on the South, leading to stricter slave laws and fueling the growing divide between pro-slavery and abolitionist forces, ultimately contributing to the tensions that ignited the American Civil War. So the revolt is one of the most notable examples of resistance to the system of slavery. And it's very closely tied in with a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that was taking place at the time.
I'm surprised you didn't mention almost one of the coolest parts about that story, though, astrologically.
The eclipses?
The eclipse.
Yeah,
The fact that he was actually inspired to lead this rebellion because of an eclipse that occurred over Virginia where he was. It was this solar eclipse at 23 Aquarius, which was in the same sign as that Jupiter Uranus conjunction in Aquarius, and he
right.
interpreted as a black man's hand moving over the sun. So he was directly inspired by that solar eclipse, and that led to that was February 11th, 1831. That happened.
Yeah, what I found with that, that was really interesting because what's interesting about that astrologically is the eclipse happened like 6 months earlier on February 12th, 1831, and it was visible in Virginia, and he took that as a sign to begin the uprising. But it ended up getting delayed until 6 months later. And the uprising itself, I don't think he planned this. I think this ended up being accidental, but then the uprising itself fell exactly on a lunar eclipse about 6 months later. Um, Even though it was the eclipse earlier in the year, 6 months earlier, that he took as the one that was significant.
And if that wasn't enough, Nat Turner himself was born October 2nd, 1800, which is the day of a lunar eclipse in Aries.
Oh
Um,
wow. Okay.
so
I didn't
you
get that
know,
part.
yeah, so there's a whole thing with eclipses there as well. And this kind of goes to your point, like you can't really avoid the eclipses. Once you're noticing them, once you're keeping an eye on them, you have to really be looking at those alongside whatever longer cycles you're looking at, because those just seem to be these triggering points for these kind of longer term things that are happening.
Yeah, honestly, the eclipses are all over the Jupiter Uranus stuff, and it was one of the coolest things as I went through Tarnas's events was noticing that additional piece that there were often eclipses taking place close to these things so that they were amplifying each other. It's like the eclipses were amplifying the Jupiter-Uranus that was already there, and the Jupiter-Uranus was amplifying the eclipses that would then take place. So with this one, I have the chart. So the rebellion started August 21st, 1831. 21st. And I think it started like later in the evening. So what
Oh,
ended up
wow.
happening, what ended up being um crazy and kind of sad is like the rebellion starts on the 21st. Um and the moon, so Jupiter is at 15 degrees of Aquarius, Uranus is at 11 degrees of Aquarius. So the conjunction is very close. And when the rebellion starts, the moon is actually conjoining Uranus and then Jupiter that day. So again, this is another one of those examples that we've talked about earlier where the moon sweeps through and acts as like a trigger point that sets off and gives you the exact timing to the day of the manifestation of the broader Jupiter Uranus conjunction that had already been taking place for a while up to that point, right?
Swish. That's all I could say. Just the swish of the net. That's a 3-pointer.
Yeah, so that's pretty impressive, but also this one's further supercharged because we can see that the south node is there at 21 degrees of Aquarius and the north node is at 21 degrees of Leo. So the part that sucks though is, so this is the first day of the uprising on August 21st, 1831, starting in the evening. Um, a day later, if you move it to August 22nd, the moon is at 25. But what happened was there was immediately on the part of the slave owners, they immediately started gathering forces. And by the second night, going into the end of the night on the morning of the 23rd, the rebellion had been crushed basically, like really brutally. And when I did the timing for this, what I realized was the eclipse was going exact at that time. At the end of the night, in the early hours of August 23rd, the lunar eclipse in Aquarius went exact at 29 degrees of Aquarius, and it would have been setting on the western horizon just before sunrise. So the night was ending. And I don't know if you could have seen it fully, but there may have been some hint of being able to see it of like, during a lunar eclipse, it's usually like a blood red moon happens at that point. And by this time, basically, the rebellion got completely crushed, and ended basically on that day on August 23rd. And
Not to mention the moon was going to be moving into opposition with both malefics.
right, as soon as it moved into Pisces, it applies to oppose
In that morning.
the Mars-Saturn conjunction. Yeah, that's a good point. And then Nat Turner himself was able to escape and wasn't captured, and he was able to evade capture for the next couple of months. But what was interesting was I noticed that Venus went retrograde just a few weeks later in Libra, and then I think it was like within a day, or maybe it was the day that Venus stationed direct in October, um, ended up being the day that he was captured.
Yeah, that's what Nick wrote about
Yeah.
back
So
in 2007. Yeah.
Nick has done work with this, with the Venus retrograde cycle and how that was tied in with broader um, theme and broader narrative of like civil rights in the United States in subsequent conjunctions or subsequent Venus retrogrades. So that's a really, depressing example, but it's one that's really important because it's one of the most striking examples of a rebellion, of an uprising, and of an attempt of an oppressed people to fight back and to throw off the shackles of oppression, basically, which is a theme that I saw come up over and over again with Jupiter-Uranus alignments. And there's a bunch that could be mentioned, but of course, the next one that's really big that happened after Tarnas's book, so that he didn't it wasn't documented there, but it was the last Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that occurred 14 years ago, and that was the one that happened on December 17th, 2010. And this is when the Arab Spring began. And the Arabic Spring began when a Tunisian street vendor named Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire as a protest against police corruption and mistreatment. And his act of desperation became a rallying point that triggered waves of protests and uprisings throughout the Middle East and North Africa. And what's interesting I found is that there was a political scientist named Mark Lynch who seems to have coined the term Arab Spring in an article that came out on the 6th of January 2011. And this was just 2 days after the conjunction went exact on January 4th, 2011. So that ended up being perfect, but also it was tied in with eclipses because there was a lunar eclipse on December 21st, 2010, and that's when after that suicide, after he set himself on fire, um, basically the uprising began in Tunisia and then started to spread to other countries. And then there was a solar eclipse on January 4th, which was just 2 days before that article happened. And it was also the day of the exact Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. So we had a simultaneous overlap of a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction on January 4th and a solar eclipse happening on January 4th at the same time.
Wow. Yeah, I always thought um the Arab Spring astrology was always especially compelling. Um, yeah, with everything that happened from that. It
Yeah.
was pretty much the most, yeah, it's like the clearest Jupiter Uranus example, that I sort of personally kind of saw and understood as that sort of phenomenon.
Yeah. I mean, it was the first time you and I were practicing astrology that we got to witness one, and you and I were writing the political astrology blog at the time. So we were documenting some of it. But so the uprising in Tunisia starts in mid to late December. By December 29th, it had spread to Algeria. Then in January, there were protests in Oman, Yemen, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, and Morocco. And then eventually, the government of Tunisia was overthrown on January 14th, just 10 days after the Jupiter Uranus conjunction and the eclipse took place. Um, but um, one of the things that was important, well, actually, two things. One, both planets then ingressed into Aries over the course of the next few months, Jupiter and Uranus. And at that point, after that, the Uranus-Pluto square really gets activated. And that seems to be the thing that carries it forward into a bigger thing that affected things the long term, whereas the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction was acting as like a trigger and like an initial flashpoint where everything exploded and got really serious. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting about the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that's a little reminiscent of some of the things that have been happening over the past year as Jupiter and Uranus have again come into alignment is on Wikipedia, even though it says that that journalist is the one that called it the Arab Spring, it says that protesters involved in the events, however, described their own political actions as, quote, uprising, intifada, or Arab, quote, awakening, or Arab Renaissance, using expressions like the Arab bitterness, dignity, or even revolution, the wara. I can't pronounce the Arabic terms, but you kind of get the point that there was this sense of like revolution, this sense of like uprising, of awakening, of renaissance, and all of those are very Jupiter conjunct Uranus terms. So
Right.
I thought that was really interesting.
Um, the fact that the Uranus-Pluto square followed after the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction is interesting, because it sort of reminds me of what you said about the French Revolution, that it sort of got kicked off by a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction and then sort of entered a different phase where it was sort of had greater importance or more long-lasting sort of consequences over the Uranus-Pluto opposition. So it's interesting that you kind of got a similar sequence.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
uh,
Here's the exact conjunction, like I said, was on January 4th, 2011, and we can see that solar eclipse at 14 degrees of Capricorn taking place at the same time. We see Jupiter and Uranus conjunct at 27 degrees of Pisces. But then, as you're saying, Pluto is already at 5 degrees of Capricorn at this point. And what would happen is that Jupiter would move into Aries first and start squaring Pluto, and then Uranus would go into Aries as well. Um, and there ended up being like the stellium in Aries, and then everything just really took off from there and took on a larger importance. Where, for example, like the government of Egypt was overthrown at one point. There was just a wave of this sort of like revolutionary uprising energy happening in many different countries.
yeah. Actually, something Nick Dagenbest had mentioned on the astrology live stream as well is that that same conjunction of the Sun and Mars and Capricorn, that a previous time that had happened was when the Shah fled Iran, right before the Iranian Revolution, and so you had that happening at the same time that the president of Tunisia is fleeing Tunisia, or Hosni Mubarak, is fleeing, Egypt. Um, and that seems to happen with this conjunction between the Sun and Mars and Capricorn, connecting those two time periods. Uh,
Yeah.
and
Check.
another interesting, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Um, so check out some of these other rebellions that I found. Um, so the Boxer Rebellion begins in China, June 20th, 1900, during that conjunction. World War One begins August 21st, 1914, around the time of a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, which famously started as a result of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, which was the thing that like set it off. Um, that's different. The Haymarket riot bomb explosion in Chicago happened May 4th, 1886. When I was going through ancient history, trying to see, because Tarnas's work is basically from 1500 forward, which is when you start getting good documentation. But I was going through some older ones with the help of Vandana, and I kept seeing like all these revolts and like uprisings and insurrections taking place. Like in the year 175, the governor of Roman Syria crushes an insurrection of shepherds known as the Bokoloi. In 186, peasants in Gaul stage an anti-tax uprising under Maternus. Roman governor Pertinax escapes an assassination attempt by British usurpers.
No relation to Firmicus, I assume.
I mean, hopefully not.
That's-
Hopefully not. I don't know. I mean, it was like Firmicus's great great grandfather.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, in the year 312, Constantine, the Battle of Milvian Bridge happens. Depending on your perspective, you could kind of argue that he was an usurper, or at least an upstart. 1251, the First Shepherds Crusade, a domestic French uprising in response to events in Egypt during the Seventh Crusade occurs. I even found one in the year 836, and this one was interesting because it was part of a triple conjunction of Jupiter, Uranus, and Pluto, um, driven by tensions between his favored Turkish guard and the populace of Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliph moves his residence from Baghdad to the new city of Samarra, which is north of Baghdad. With brief interruptions, it would stay there until 892. So his troops, who were from groups that had previously held only a marginal role in the Islamic world, were deeply unpopular among the residents of Baghdad, and violent incidences had repeatedly broken out between the soldiers and Baghdadis. So basically, there were like uprisings and unrest, so much so that the caliph, or the king at the time, had to like move his capital to another city due to the unrest that was taking place under this Jupiter-Uranus conjunction.
Wow. Uh, it's tends to not be so good for leaders. These Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions. Whoever's the established power, Uranus, is that rattle them.
Yeah, I mean, some of them attempt to maintain control over a mob and like clamp down, but they're not necessarily always successful. Like sometimes they're just not successful. Other times they are, and there's like a brutal attempt at suppression. I think sometimes the other planets involved can sometimes dictate the success or failure of some of the uprisings that take place at the time.
Hmm.
So
That's
another
incredible.
uprising,
You're like
yeah,
the ancient rebellion hunter. You pluck these out of the dusty history books and make them new again.
yeah. Well, there's actually more. So there's a few more, but they're ones that end up having their rebellions that have a wider import. So one of them that is really weird is that in the year 1209 AD, the College of Cambridge is founded. And this is the year of a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Virgo on July 31st, 1209 CE, that's active for that entire year. So what's weird about it is that Cambridge, there's this weird story I didn't know about the founding of Cambridge until I started researching this. Cambridge was founded in 1209 when a bunch of scholars fled from Oxford because three scholars had been hanged by a town mob after a woman was murdered. So there's some sort of weird, bizarre story that's not very well documented, but um, there was a woman who was murdered by one of the scholars, and there was a town mob that was riled up to go find this murderer, but they didn't find the actual murderer. Instead, they found like three people who may or may not have been associated with him, and the mob just immediately did sort of extrajudicial justice, and they hung the three scholars that they found, even though the three scholars pled their innocence. So, as a result of those three scholars getting killed, apparently a bunch of the other scholars who were part of Oxford at that point packed up their bags along with their students, and they fled and ended up settling in Cambridge um, as a result of fearing further reprisals from the townspeople. And this eventually is what led to Cambridge becoming a full-fledged university.
Yeah. Wow, I love the fact that it happened in Virgo as well, right? The sign of ruled by Mercury. So it's the establishment of a new college, and it's amazing how it's still there. You can still go to Cambridge and Oxford. Um, that's wild.
Yeah, so it's still there. Um, so that was one of the ones. There was one other like uprising one that I wanted to mention though that I was very surprised by. Let me see if I can find it. I have like I wrote like 36 pages of notes, so that's part of the reason why um
Wow, incredible.
it's a little tricky.
Control F is your friend.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what it even was. Oh yeah. It was I've talked about this at different points before, but I wanted to re-mention it again because it ties in with this theme. And Tarnas mentioned it in passing in our interview, but I wanted to emphasize it because it's one of the most striking ones. Every time I come across it again, I'm always surprised. Um, the Stonewall riots. So,
Right.
um, you know,
1969.
1969, in the early hours of June 28th, 1969, um, the Stonewall Inn, which was a gay bar in Greenwich Village, New York, there was a series of spontaneous, often violent demonstrations by members of the LGBTQ plus community against a police raid that occurred, where, tired of the oppression, patrons of the Stonewall Inn and other local bars and the neighborhood's LGBTQ community fought back against the police that night. So the resistance grew over several nights, fueled by years of pent-up frustration and anger. But the impact was that the Stonewall riots are widely considered a turning point for the LGBTQ rights movement. They inspired a surge of activism, the formation of many gay rights organizations, and increased visibility for the community. annual pride marches grew from the legacy of Stonewall. So this is incredibly striking because Uranus was at 0 degrees of Libra. It had just moved into Libra, basically, and Jupiter was at 27 degrees of Virgo, and Pluto was at 22 degrees of Virgo. Um, so this is another example of like an uprising of riots taking place. But in this instance, it's one which acted as a turning point where some positive change actually did come out of those riots.
Yeah. And again, how perfect is it that it's in Libra, and it pertains to sexual orientation, gender identity, and like a bar, which is like supposed to be like a recreational place, and this is about yeah, it just I think the kind of Venusian aspect of that Jupiter conjunction Libra is really appropriate for that. It's interesting too to consider that when Uranus got to Aries, um, that is when we seem to have reached a turning point in, say, like the gay marriage fight. It was during the time that Uranus was in Aries that gay marriage became legalized in New York before it was legalized on a national level in 2015. So there's kind of a lot of the things that sort of came um out of the revolution that started at Stonewall in some ways kind of reached a point of like ultimate sort of victories or victories at the highest level once Uranus managed to get to the opposite sign 42 years later.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So yeah, we can see here in the Stonewall chart, which it started basically at around 1:20 a.m. on January 28th, 1969, and Aries was rising and Uranus was at 0 degrees and 3 minutes of Libra. It had just moved in to the sign of Libra when this
Wow.
event happens. So yeah, incredibly striking. And then of course, um, so the moon landing, of course, is the exact conjunction of Jupiter and Uranus is on July 20th, a few weeks later, and that's the moon landing.
Yeah,
So,
that's wild.
yeah, so I just want to use that as an example of another uprising where sometimes the uprisings are successful or there's like actual change that is enacted at these times that has a lasting impact. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out, um, nowadays. All right.
Right.
So other stuff, um, Tarnas mentioned this in the last one, but I wanted to mention it and expand on it. But it's this, have you heard of this thing, the mother of all tech demos?
No, mother of
So
all tectonics.
there was this presentation by this scholar, he was a professor named Douglas Engelbart, and the presentation happened on December 9th, 1968, when Jupiter and Uranus were both at exactly 3 degrees of Libra. And this is 2 days before the exact conjunction took place on December 11th. And um, it was this revolutionary demo where he introduced several different fundamental technologies that we still take for granted today, including the computer mouse, hypertext, like clicking links, video conferencing, like we're doing here with Zoom, Windows, like having different programs in Windows, word processing, collaborative working. It was basically this like visionary thing that showcased the potential for computers to be used as tools for enhancing the human intellect, decades before personal computers were commonplace. And it tied together like a bunch of different technologies that were being developed prior to that time, or that were new technologies that were sort of like visionary, but in their infancy. And that's a really common theme that I've noticed, is that many of the technology ones that we've mentioned that were technological turning points, they're usually technological turning points because a few different earlier technologies are being combined at that time and synthesized to create something new. So that's one of the things you have to watch out for at Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions is sometimes it's incorporating things that are old to create something new.
Usually things that might themselves come about at Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions. And didn't like the first version of the internet come from like the 1969, like the sort of original like ARPANET infrastructure? Wasn't that also from that late 60s conjunction?
Yeah, that's going to be my next one
Oh, so I keep
that I want to
jumping your
show.
gun.
Yeah. I'm just trying to see if I can find, I had a chart saved. I had like 400 charts laid out. So that's my problem here with
Yeah, Beth does the same thing.
we're
Retained is like I'm like scrolling. Um,
okay. Well,
yeah.
let me just type it up again. So the demo was on December 9th. It was, I actually don't have a time. I've been looking for a time for this and I'd really like to find one. So if anybody's ever able to track that down, we have a recording of the presentation. It's actually really wild and I'd recommend watching it. Um, but I was not able to track down a time. But here is the chart for that roughly. And look at this. It's literally right at the conjunction.
Wow.
So hugely crucial. Many different technologies that we take for granted today are basically first demonstrated in this demo. And Douglas Engelbrecht, who was the guy that presented it, he was actually born just 6 days after a solar eclipse in Libra. And Libra, of course, is where that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction took place there. So interestingly, the following year, Engelbrecht and his lab was actually involved with what many people refer to as the birth of the internet. So, and what happened with this is that in 1969, the technical specifications and protocols that would become the foundation of the internet were established in January. And then the first two nodes of a network of two labs basically were connected in September of 1969. And then the following month in October, the first message was successfully sent between them using this network or using this internet. So that the technology that was new, that was the innovation at this time, was packet switching. And this was the crucial technology that was developed and then eventually employed starting in this year of 1969. So Jupiter was in Libra from November 15th of 1968 until August 15th of 1970. And then there were three conjunctions, December 11th, 1968, March 11th, 1969, and July 20th of 1969. So it ends up like very well falling together with this, where in January of 1969, the researchers published the documents which set out the technical specifications and protocols that would become the foundation of the internet. And then on September 2nd, 1969, that's when the first node of ARPANET was installed at UCLA.
Hmm.
Um, and they actually have, I think I have a time for this, September 2nd, 19, because it was about 10 a.m. in Los Angeles. So here's the chart for that because there was something interesting I found about the chart, which is that we see Mercury at 7 degrees of Libra and it's conjoining Jupiter at 18 degrees of Libra, which are both conjunct Uranus, which is at 2 degrees of Libra. So that's pretty striking.
Also
Um,
eclipse season,
it's
for what it's
also
worth.
eclipse season. It's actually falling in between two eclipses because
Right.
the first eclipse, a lunar eclipse, had taken place on August 27th, just days before this took place on September 2nd. And then there would be a solar eclipse in Virgo coming up just a week or two after that, basically. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing was that on October 29th, 1969, the first successful message was sent over ARPANET from UCLA to Stanford Research Institute. Um, and the message they were trying to send was login, Login, but only the first two letters were transmitted before the system crashed, so that it ended up just sending the word low, Lo, which some people have then laughed because then it's kind of like lo and behold, um, from the Bible, basically. So Douglas Engelbert's lab was on one side of the connection. So that's really important. So it means the guy that did the mother of all demos was involved in this. And um, you can actually see some of the nature of it in this chart, because in the chart for when the first message is sent, we now have a full-fledged Libra stellium because Venus has ingressed into Libra. So we have Uranus at 6 degrees of Libra, Venus at 15, Jupiter at 20, Mercury at 25. And I'm fascinated by this because one of the things that's funny here is that Mercury at 25, 57 Libra, it's very closely applying to a square with Mars at 2604 Capricorn. And of course, the very first
Message
message
was cut
sent,
off.
it was cut off. It was severed halfway through the very first message that's ever sent over the internet. That's pretty good, right?
That's this is I know about this stuff and it's still blowing my mind, Um it's
Yeah. Well, it's like it's something to read about it and say like, oh, that's really cool. That's really interesting to read it as like a sentence or somebody saying it, but to look at the chart and like parse what that actually means and what the steps were that were involved and to see how well it lines up with, the alignments and the conjunctions is just staggering when you add it all up. And that was one of the experiences I had going back through and rereading Tarnas's book again for like the 10th time, at least those Jupiter-Uranus chapters,
yeah,
is
no, yeah,
seeing the
could
amount
read
of
that every now
research
and
that went
again.
into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
So,
definitely one of my favorite books, favorite astrology books of all time, for sure.
yeah. All right. So, only other one I want to mention that's a tech one is I've mentioned this before, but the Think Different ad campaign. I did a bunch of research on this, and let me just show it
Well,
really
Apple's
quickly.
like almost Jupiter Uranus the whole way through, right? To today, actually. Um,
Exactly. Well, so we have this ad campaign in 1997. And one of the things you have to understand about Apple is Apple's stock was just in the toilet at that point. The company was failing hugely financially, um, and struggling. And what happened is that they were in the process of bringing back the founder of the company, who was Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs, of course, was born with a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in the sign of Cancer. So we have a time chart for Steve Jobs. Here's the chart with Virgo rising and Jupiter at 20 degrees of or 20 degrees of Cancer and Uranus at 24 degrees of Cancer. So that we have a very close conjunction within 4 degrees. So Tarnas mentioned how there's a Jupiter-Uranus opposition when Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak built their first personal computer in their garage, which eventually is what founded and became Apple Computer. In the 1980s, Steve Jobs brought on a new CEO to help run the company. And he brought on this new CEO who was a former executive of like Pepsi. So he brought in a guy who he thought was going to be a good CEO that had run a huge company before to help him, head up this fledgling company of Apple. And what's funny is he brought Steve Scully on as CEO on April 8th, 1983, which was during a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. So Steve Scully ended up then not too long after that being involved in a boardroom coup where Jobs was ousted from the company entirely and ended up leaving and having to go found some other company for several years at that point.
yeah, that was a Saturn return, basically.
Yeah, it was a
Um,
really rough Saturn return for Jobs.
yeah.
So
Sorry,
so
good.
but but then by 1997, Jobs is like he's been brought back as an advisor. But during the course of 1997, Jobs is basically able to angle it so that he's able to come back into a leadership role of basically running the company again in 1997. And this is the year of a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Aquarius. And one of the most important things that Jobs does that year is over the summer, he meets with an ad agency. And over the course of the next few months, they formulate this ad campaign, um, which is the Think Different ad campaign. And basically, the ad campaign used images of iconic thinkers and rebels like Einstein and Gandhi, along with a powerful message celebrating those who challenged the norm. And the campaign helped to redefine Apple's image, portraying the company as a brand for innovators and those who dare to be different. So it perfectly like encapsulated the Jupiter-Uranus energy. And what's bizarre about the ad, I hadn't like actually watched the video version in a while, but some of the first celebrities that it features have the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. So for example, it features like Bob Dylan, for example, who was born in a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction.
The
It
1941 one.
Oh right. It
Yeah.
has John Lennon, who was also born at a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction.
So
I haven't
cool.
gone through and checked like all the other celebrities to see if other ones do, but there might be others for all I know, because I didn't check all of them.
Yeah. And it's very similar to the 1984 ad, that was released during the Super Bowl, the 1980, the one where that athlete like throws the javelin or something through the dictator screen, and it's sort of, showing this way that Apple products are sort of, revolutionary in some sense. So I feel like it's a perfect dovetail, and happens to be at these Jupiter Uranus junctures that these things even come out.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's amazing.
S-
It's a really amazing chain from Jobs all the way through to these major plot points of Apple's history.
Exactly. So um I found the exact date. So I'm pretty sure the original ad for the Think Different ad campaign, I think they launched it with great fanfare on September 28th, 1997, when Jupiter was at 12 degrees of Aquarius and Uranus was at 4 degrees. And um, what happened is it ended up being wildly successful. And Apple got a big boost from the ads and its stock price tripled within a year, which helped to save the company, which at that point, earlier in the year, Jobs had to negotiate Microsoft, like the former rival of of the company, and his former rival Bill Gates, to bail out Apple. Things were so bad. So I wanted to read the original script though, because it's actually really impressive. And I think it's one of the most evocative Jupiter-Uranus things, that was saying something about the time period. Even though it's like an ad and even though it was put together by an ad agency, there's something striking about it. So the ad says, here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Is that sort of like the Orphic hymn to Uranus or something? It's
Right, yeah.
like, um, yeah, hilarious. Wow.
Yeah, if you ever wanted to have like a better invocation of the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, I think that's it. And it weirdly ties together a lot of the themes that we've talked about
Absolutely.
and examples that we've brought together today.
So when we got to the 2010-2011 Jupiter Uranus conjunction, the only thing that seems to pop out of me about Apple at that time is that's when it like releases the iPad. and sort of introduces this whole tablet era of computing. Because before that, that device hadn't, that category hadn't really existed. The sort of intermediate space between like a smartphone versus a desktop.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I mean, the biggest thing is that they just over the previous few years, they'd introduced the iPhone, but the whole smartphone, mobile phone revolution had just fully started to take off at that point, and they were the ones who had led that, but that transformation was still taking place around that time of
right.
that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction.
I think the iPhone thing was like, wasn't that a Jupiter-Uranus square a few years prior?
Hmm.
That's what I thought it was. Um,
Yeah, I haven't looked up the date. I just know, I just remember from myself, like back then, sort of resisting initially. Like, actually, I didn't resist. It was just expensive. It was like a product that not everybody could afford, but very quickly other companies did get on board, and like, eventually Google released their smartphone to compete with the iPhone. And I just remember around that time with my websites, like you started having to create like a mobile version of your website because very quickly there was this shift where the majority of internet users went from people that were using laptops and desktop computers to using their phone. And nowadays it's just like that's it's wildly dominant in
mhm,
terms of the majority of internet traffic you'll get on any website is primarily from mobile phone users.
mhm. Yeah, no, that's true. I think my first like smartphone was in the aftermath of that period. But the first iPhone was released June 29th, 2007, which is well within that Jupiter-Uranus square of when Jupiter was in Sagittarius, square
Wow.
Uranus in Pisces. Um,
There it
so
is.
yeah.
So that's like the
Oh,
waning square of
oh,
the
pardon me.
Jupiter-Uranus cycle.
June 29th, 2007 was the date of the release.
I'm
Um,
seeing I'm seeing the announcement. So this is the
oh, okay. Yeah,
announcement
so
of
you
it.
can see
So
that it's wow, the announcement's even closer.
yeah, this is his famous announcement. He actually did this. He did these legendary um, presentations where he would launch to great fanfare like the latest technology, and it was something he was known for, especially with the iPod. The iPod demo was very famous, but this is probably one of the most famous tech announcements that he ever did because of the way, again, that it brought together many different technologies and put them all into one new sort of quasi revolutionary technology.
Yeah, you could say that. Um, Absolutely.
Yeah, so for the audio listeners, Uranus was at 11 degrees of Pisces and it was square Jupiter at 10 degrees of Sagittarius. So that's really interesting because then it ties into, the cycle of the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that started with his return to Apple and taking over the company and doing that Think Different campaign in 1997. This is the waning square that's tied in with that cycle. So it's one of the final important turning points before the next conjunction.
Which brings us to today. And Apple hasn't released anything new in a very long time, except for this year, right? Where they released this entirely new well, not entirely new, because technically Zuckerberg beat them to it by a few years, but it is interesting that this cycle of Jupiter and Uranus is extending even beyond Steve Jobs' own life, and is continuing to be important for things that Apple is doing. So it's sort of living on. And so yeah, the Apple Vision Pro, this augmented reality, virtual reality headset. Um, this reminds me so much of what you had talked about with this mother of all demos demonstration, getting a glimpse into the future. It may seem kind of strange and silly to us right now, um, but it's possible, um, that this other type of communication and computing, sort of spatial computing, may become uh, something we kind of take for granted in the future, in the same way we take hyperlinks and mouses and the internet sort of for granted.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a major development this year with that conjunction is like virtual reality and spatial computing as they're pushing it. Like that's the term that they've developed in order to describe what they're trying to do with it. Apple's also moving into artificial intelligence. And so I think there's like visible things that we can see that Apple's doing, but there may be also some other developments that maybe we can't see or will only become relevant in retrospect. And something I just realized is I just remembered Steve Jobs died in 2011. So he would have stepped down from the company, and his last year leading the company and then stepping down would have been
The
that
Jupiter-Uranus.
that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. So it ended up bookmarking the end of his career with Apple as well.
That's that is wow.
Yeah. So
Uh
there's another Jupiter-Uranus recurrence sequence for you of somebody who was born at a Jupiter Uranus conjunction, having some of the most important and defining events of their life happen at Jupiter Uranus conjunctions as well.
yeah, no, he's I mean, almost a paradigmatic example of that in in this, you know, context, this modern
Yeah,
context.
for sure. Um, all right. So I'm just glancing through. I honestly think that might be a good stopping point. I think we've exhausted most of the main ones that I wanted to cover, and especially ending with that think different thing, because I think there was something about that that ended up arising spontaneously at that time that captured the quality of the moment. I think there will be other things happening during this time frame this year, which will also arise spontaneously and capture the quality of the moment. And some of those are already evident, and other things I think may only become clear in retrospect once whatever is planted, once the seeds of what's planted during this time eventually begins to grow and bear fruit. But we'll look back on it at different points in the future and realize that this was the beginning of an important turning point in the world, either in terms of technology, in terms of scientific breakthroughs and understandings about the universe, in terms of the constant human striving for freedom and self-autonomy, um, and to not be oppressed. So many of these different themes, I think we'll look back on this year and this time frame as being an important one that relates to all of those topics in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, I see it in my own life as well. The those sort of themes are really huge in my life, and actually have been for quite a while, as Jupiter and Uranus have both been in my 10th. Uh, I I could discuss them if I wanted to, but I'd say probably the biggest one for me, at least, is when Jupiter and when Jupiter entered Taurus and joined up with Uranus in my 10th house. That was when I started taking a more uh I became president of Capasar, for example. So I kind of upgraded my level of participation in the world of astrology on a sort of organizational level with this new title. Um, I also was able to last summer, whereas Jupiter was coming really, really close to Uranus, I used ChatGPT. I used AI, this revolution technology, to actually code my first like little software project, and you can actually get it. It's available on the Chrome web store as a Chrome extension. It's called Astroglyph. It allows you to audit it allows you to very easily copy and paste astrological symbols into whatever document you're working on, or wherever you're working online. Because normally it's kind of annoying to have to like copy paste astrological symbols from some obscure list on the internet. So with my Chrome extension that I programmed without knowing anything about code through ChatGPT, you can now very easily just like click a button on your browser and automatically bring up a list of clickable symbols that allow you to easily paste astrological symbols wherever you want. And my work in this area, my work with coding and working with AI has um, really accelerated. And I can't go into too much more detail about that at this time, but I've even taken time off from seeing clients in order to work on this new project that I'm working on that is sort of along these lines. And You might be hearing about more about that soon. But that has been something which has really um, erupted in my life in a huge way. That I've been able to sort of take advantage of some of the possibilities of this technology and do things that I didn't think or know that I might have been capable of before, but have extraordinary possibility. And so I really see that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in my 10th house as a reason why these things are happening. So just on a personal level, I really see that in a big way.
Yeah, for sure. And that actually reminds me, there was one last example I meant to share because it's the one that's probably the most relevant to technology and the technological developments that are taking place at this time, which is at the 1997 conjunction of Jupiter and Uranus, was the first time a computer, an artificial intelligence, beat the world champion in a chess match. So this is a
Wow.
famous chess match between the computer called Deep Blue, which defeated the world chess champion at the time, who was Gary Kasparov. Um, so I actually have the chart for that. Let's take a look. So here's the chart. This is just day chart. Location and time is not correct, but we can see that Jupiter is at 20 degrees of Aquarius and Uranus is at 8 degrees of Aquarius. Um, so this was a rematch, but basically IBM's Deep Blue defeated Gary Kasparov in the last game of the rematch. And the significance is that this was a watershed moment representing a major step forward for artificial intelligence. It demonstrated the potential for computers to surpass humans in complex intellectual tasks. Um, and I think this is relevant today because obviously over the course of the past year, ever since Jupiter went into Taurus a year ago in May of 2023, we've just seen this huge rise in focus of artificial intelligence. And we can see that the technologies are growing by leaps and bounds at just this rate that seems, would have seemed
Impossible. Yeah.
unimaginable even just a few years ago. So, and I think this is tied into, and this is part of a longer term thing that we're going to look back on with this decade as a crucial turning point, um, partially because we're heading into a Uranus-Pluto trine that's forming right now, and that's going to start peaking over the course of the second half of this decade, where Uranus and Pluto are again moving into alignment when Uranus goes into Gemini starting next year in 2025. It's going to begin trining Pluto in Aquarius. So we have Pluto in Aquarius, which is already significant for technology in and of itself. And we have Uranus going to Gemini, which is significant for communications, especially, but also technology in general, accentuating each other in the same way that they did in the 1960s when you had that Jupiter-Pluto conjunction for most of the decade. And what's happening right now this year is it's getting basically gasoline is getting thrown on what is now only a small fire by the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that's taking place at this time. Um, and I think that's really significant and really striking. And AI is obviously one of the major things that we're looking at in terms of that, and in terms of the way that it's already changing things. But there may be some sort of important turning point, or the foundation for an important turning point that's being laid right now around this time frame this month as the Jupiter-Uranus alignment is going exact.
Yeah. In fact, the Llama 3 is supposed to drop very, very soon, like almost imminently, which is Llama 2 is one of the most sophisticated large language learning models out there. And so this is like highly anticipated with this launch of this update of Llama 3. So that is coming out very, very shortly, right as this Jupiter-Uranus conjunction will be happening. So that's a surefire sign, that everything you're saying is probably going to be extremely on point in hindsight.
Yeah, and I mean, there's even going to be scientific fields that we're not anticipating. Like one of them that's way out there that's already being affected by artificial intelligence is new discoveries in material sciences, like new synthesizing new materials that didn't exist before, and the way that artificial intelligence is being used to leverage that and discover new things. That actually would also fit the symbolism of the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction happening in Taurus very well because materials and material science, or the idea of the material world, is very much tied in with to Taurus, in addition to the other themes that we've talked about of like monetary themes with like Bitcoin or just technology themes, as we've discussed over and over again with other conjunctions.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to facilitate explosion revolutions in various fields, right? I mean, this is the potential of this technology is disruptive to so many fields, even the arts. This is what the writer strikes and actor strikes, are partly about, were fears of how this technology could replace actors and all the professionals who work in these fields. And that's another Taurus thing, right? The arts, another kind of Venusian area that could be disrupted. And I think it might have been hard to imagine how exactly that could happen, except that we've seen these previews of things like Sora that provide text to video generation with AI, which can produce extremely realistic and very, very impressive looking um, cinematography. It's, really, and this is just where we are now. These things have a
Yeah,
tendency to get radically better over time. So
yeah, this is
it's
just the
easy to
beginning
see. Yeah,
with all of this stuff. So
right.
one of the things I will say, one of the final things that can be, it's an easy prediction to make, which is just because it's a conjunction, it's setting up a new 14-year cycle. So it's setting up a new 14-year cycle here at the conjunction in 2024, so that there's some new technologies that will start to grow, or there's some new developments related to the Jupiter-Uranus archetype that will start growing here. They'll reach an important and critical turning point at the Jupiter-Uranus square, especially around 2020, late 2027, early 2028. They'll reach another critical turning point around 2031 when Jupiter reaches the opposition with Uranus. There'll be another final critical turning point at the waning square, which looks like it's around 2034. And then finally, the cycle will come to a close, and there'll be a looking back and a reflection point where a lot of the older technologies that have grown over that cycle will be integrated into new ones at the next conjunction of Jupiter and Uranus, which looks like it will take place in 2037 and 2038.
And what sign would that be in?
Um,
It
don't
would
know.
be
I mean, two signs over probably. So if it's in
so roughly
Taurus,
Cancer then.
yeah, if it's in Taurus now, it'll probably be in Cancer.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So of course, that's going to be on the tail end of like a bunch of stuff. Like that'll be at the tail end of Jupiter, um, or Uranus completing its transit through
Mm,
Gemini, which is going to be huge and transformative in a number of different ways, but especially for communication and for travel, especially short
yeah.
distance travel. And then by 2038, we'll be getting towards the later part of Pluto in Aquarius, which is also going to be hugely transformational for social technologies and for the internet and other things like that.
Yeah. you know, that Jupiter Uranus conjunction in Cancer and in the 2030s. That reminds me of how in 1954, one of the things that happened with the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Cancer of the mid 1950s was the discovery of the structure of the DNA helix, which I thought
Mm.
was interesting because Cancer is like the sign of the moon, which is like the natural world and like biology, genetics. So I would wonder if that 2030s one would relate in some way to some radical advance in genetics and genetic uh, technologies. It's hard not to imagine how that wouldn't happen. Just already we've had a lot of advances, but that I would think that since that one was kind of setting up a kind of Cancerian type of revolution, I would wonder if there would be something similar about the one in the 2030s. Maybe this is when people really are having, children outside the womb and things, this sort of thing. Um,
Yeah, I mean, so here's the, repetition of the 83-year period and the great hexagon or grand sextile that creates in terms of the repetitions of the Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions. But yeah, there were those three conjunctions in Cancer from 1954 to 1955, and then that will be repeated again from 2037 through 2038 in Cancer. So one of the things we've demonstrated here broadly is that in order to predict the future, you have to look into the past. So the answers to that alignment and many future ones will come through going back and studying the history, which is part of what we've tried to do here today in demonstrating some of these examples. And it's something that Richard Tarnas really paved the way for, in our work with his just monumental work, Cosmos and Psyche, which, is basically required reading for any serious astrologer, I think, at this point.
yeah, it's not even that's not a joke or anything. That is just straight up. It is probably the most important astrological text written in our times.
Right.
Maybe, Study of Fate and Fortune, makes it on that list too.
I
Time will
mean,
tell.
we'll see. We'll see in retrospect where people are ranking things, but
But
yeah,
it's very important. It is a very important book.
yeah. All right. So I think that's it. I think that's it. Is there anything
Yeah.
else we need to say? Or
Oh,
I mean, I think
nah.
yeah. I think we're in pretty good shape. So shout out to Archetypal Explorer. I showed some graphs at archetypalexplorer.com, the waves. I don't know if I mentioned at the beginning, so I just want to give them credit. Shout out to Peter from AstroSeek for his amazing charts and the hexagon diagram. And thank you, Patrick, for joining me today for this. It was kind of I have Uranus on the midheaven, so I do things a little bit on the fly sometimes. Sometimes at the last minute, I sort of thrive at the last minute, throwing things together in intense periods of research that then sort of like burst forth sort of all at once or suddenly. And sometimes that can be a bit much, but thanks for joining me today to do this.
Oh,
I
thanks.
really appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, I think this is just right for me. I was born like less than 24 hours of a Jupiter-Uranus trine.
Mm.
So I often respond really strongly to this cycle in general, and often in more positive ways. Uh, so yeah, this was right up my alley.
Awesome. Good. Well, I hope it sets a new foundation for research. And one of the things we need is there's so much more research to do. I'm sure there's many other Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions in history that we've overlooked or we're not aware of yet. Especially, I only barely started to look outside of the history of Western culture and found that example from that Chinese polymath in the second century. Or earlier in the year, I did that work with Nick Diggin Best where I was looking at Pluto and Aquarius and finding that often coincided with important turning points in Chinese history. So I'm sure there's a lot of other histories from different cultures that could add to this. And I hope that people will go through and search for other Jupiter-Uranus conjunctions that were striking and let us know in the comments below this episode on YouTube if you find a good example, because it's through that sort of community effort that I think we can take astrology to the next level by comparing and sharing our findings together. And through that, we'll create, a sort of the next evolution of astrology by compiling the wisdom of thousands of years of historical research that now is at our fingertips. So yeah, let us know if you find a good example in the comments below this video on YouTube. Otherwise, I think that's it for this episode of the Astrology Podcast. So thanks everyone for watching or listening, and we'll see you again next time. If you appreciate the work I'm doing here on the podcast and you'd like to find a way to support it, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to some great subscriber benefits, including early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the forecast each month, our monthly Auspicious Elections podcast, which is only available to patrons, a whole exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. You can find out more information at patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Shout out to our sponsor for this episode, which is the Chani app, the #1 astrology app for self-discovery, mindfulness, and healing. You can download it on the Apple App Store or on Google Play, or for more information, visit app.chani.com. Special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including patrons Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, and Sunny Bazbaz. If you're looking for a reliable astrologer to get an astrological consultation with, then we have a new list of astrologers on the podcast website that we recommend for readings. Most of the astrologers specialize in birth chart readings, although some also offer synastry, rectification, electional astrology, horary questions, and more. Find out more information at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software that we use and recommend here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available for the PC at alabe.com. Use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we recommend a software program called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is from the creators of SolarFire for PC, and it includes both modern and traditional techniques. You can find out more information at astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I'd recommend checking out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I go over the history, philosophy, and techniques of ancient astrology, taking people from beginner up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. If you're really looking to expand your studies of astrology, then I would recommend my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course on ancient astrology, where I take people through basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, as well as guided readings of ancient texts, and by the time you finish the course, you will have a strong foundation in how to read birth charts, as well as make predictions. You can find out more information at courses.theastrologyschool.com. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is a quarterly astrology magazine, which you can read in print or online at mountainastrologer.com. And the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening both in person and online, May 23rd through the 27th, 2024. You can find out more information at norwac.net.